In the small hours of that shift, in the deep of the hive called Threnos, 2 kilometers beneath a sky that Relvanter had never once seen, a man sat on the lip of a conveyor trough and held a rat's tail between his fingers and did not eat it at once, because good things must be made to last, and good things had been scarce with him all his life. He had found it in the day's ration, coiled gray against the gray of the paste, and for a moment he had thought it was a fault in the mixing, and then he had understood what it was, and something in him had gone very still and very careful, the way a man goes still who has been handed a thing that can be lost. It was meat. On that factory floor in that year, in that life, a rat's tail was meat, and meat was the finest thing that had happened to him in a season, and he divided it across 2 separate bites, and between the bites he sat unmoving and counted himself, in his own private reckoning, a fortunate man. He was one of a number he could not have counted if he had wished to, and he did not wish to, for the counting of such things was no comfort. The hive of Threnos held its people the way a mine holds ore, in seams and pockets, and deep exhausted galleries, tens of millions of them stacked in the dark between the machines, and Relvanter was one seam of it, one pocket, one grain, and the world above the hive held 100 hives, and the Imperium above the world held 100,000 worlds, and somewhere unimaginably far up, at the top of all of it, there was said to be a man on a golden throne who loved each one of them by name. Rel did not spend much thought on the man on the throne. A God who loved you, and a God who had never once in 40 years sent so much as a clean ration or a kind word down the 2 kilometers to where you stood, were, from where Rel stood, difficult to tell apart, and he had long since given up the distinguishing of them, and had put the whole question away in the place where he kept the sky, among the things that other people said were real. They did not know his name on the manufacturing floor. They knew his number, and the number was longer than his name and more important than it, and when the shift master checked him against the board, he checked the number and did not look at the face. No one looked at the face. In 40 years on that floor, not one living soul had ever raised their eyes and met his, and he had grown so used to this that he no longer felt it, the way a man ceases to feel the recycled air he has breathed since birth, and only now and then, in a quiet hour such as this one, did some small buried part of him remember that it had once been a hurt. The paste he ate by ration was made of reprocessed algae and reprocessed insect, and of those who had not survived the previous shift, and this last was not spoken of on the floor, but it was known by all of them, and the knowing of it lay in the stomach heavier than the paste itself. So a rat's tail was no small thing. It was clean meat, or as clean as anything came so far down, and it had died a rat and not a man, and for that reason alone Relvanter made it last. He had been told there was a sky. He had been told there was a caring, attentive emperor who loved him, so he knew the worth of the things men told each other in the dark. He worked 16 hours in a shift and slept standing when he was fortunate, and in 40 years he had risen exactly nowhere, and neither had his father before him, whose number he could no longer remember, nor his father before that. To the men who stood above him, he was not a person. He was a unit of production that had, by some inconvenience of birth, been fitted with a face. The day the press took 2 fingers off his left hand, the medic did not lift his head. He scratched something on a slate and waved the next man forward, and Rel wrapped the hand in rag and finished the shift, because a shift not finished was a ration not issued, and there was no third thing to weigh against the 2. He had not wept. He could not have said, if asked, when he had last wept or what over. That part of him had been ground down long ago, patiently across years, into something smooth and quiet and cheap. There was a man who worked the station beside his, whom he knew as Bex, though whether that was a name or only a sound, the man answered to Rel had never learned, for they did not speak. They had stood a meter apart for 11 years and exchanged in all that time perhaps 100 words, and every one of those words had been about the line, a jam in the feed, or a fault in the press, or a warning that the overseer was coming down the gantry. That was the whole of what they were to each other, and it was as much as most men on the floor were to anyone. And when Bex did not come to his station one shift, and did not come the next, Rel did not ask after him, because there was no one to ask, and nothing asking would have changed. A week later the paste came a little grayer than usual, and a little richer, and Rel ate it, because it was issued, and because a man who thought too long about the paste did not last on the floor, and he did not let himself wonder whether some part of what he swallowed had, 11 days before, warned him about the overseer on the gantry. That was the arithmetic of the deep hive, and every man on the floor had learned it, and having learned it, learned never to say it aloud. He slept standing when he slept at all, wedged into the angle of a stanchion with the vibration of the reactors coming up through the metal into his bones, and he dreamed when he dreamed of nothing he could carry into waking. He rose when the shift horn sounded, and he stood at the wicket for his ration, and he went to his station, and he stood at it for 16 hours, and then he did it again, and the days did not so much pass as accumulate, one indistinguishable from another, a great grey drift of them piling up behind him toward a death that would be marked, if it was marked at all, by the striking of a number from aboard. This was the life the Imperium named in its proclamations, the life of a valued subject of the God Emperor. In practice he was a consumable that was cheaper to bury than to feed, and the accountants of the hive had worked that out long before Relvanter was born, and priced him accordingly, and the price was low. And it was into this life, in the last hour of that shift, that some people came and stood before him, and did the thing that no one had done in 40 years. They looked at him. There were 3 of them, and they came up out of one of the old exhausted service tunnels that ran off the Manufactorum sump, the kind of tunnel the engineers had sealed and forgotten a century before, and they did not have the look of the floor about them. They were not clean, for no one down there was clean, but there was something unhurried in them, something that had a little slack in it, as though they were people who owned a small portion of their own time, which was a wealth Relvanter had never possessed. One of them was a woman, not young, with a broad and weathered face, and she came and sat down on the lip of the trough beside him, as if she had all the time in the world, and looked at the rag on his hand, and asked him how he was doing. He did not answer at first, because he did not understand the question. No one had ever asked it of him. It was not a thing said on the floor. On the floor a man was told what to do and told when he had failed to do it, and the space between those two was silence, and into that silence now this woman had put a question, and it landed on Relvanter like a weight he did not know how to carry. She asked again, gently, and did not look away, and he found that he could not look away either, and that the meeting of her eyes was almost more than he could bear, and that some old wound he had thought long closed had begun very quietly to open. Her name was Mara. She did not tell him this at once, and he did not ask, for asking was another thing not done on the floor, but he learned it over the days that followed, and in learning it he learned that he had begun to have days that were shaped around something other than the shift. She told him there was a place, an old tunnel off the sump, where a few people gathered who did not think that this was all a life should be. She said it plainly and without pressing, and then she rose and went back into the dark and left the saying of it with him. He did not go the first night, nor the second. He was afraid, though he could not have named of what. On the 3rd night his ration failed to issue, some error of the number against the board, and he stood at the wicket, while the servitor blinked its slow refusal at him, and there was no appeal, and there was no supper, and he understood again, as he had understood 1,000 times, exactly what he was worth to the men above him, which was less than the cost of correcting an error. And so on the 3rd night, with nothing in his belly, and nothing to lose that had not already been taken, Relvanter went down into the old tunnel. They fed him. That was the first thing, and it was not the paste. It was real food, warm, and it had shape and texture, and more than one taste in it, and they gave it to him without weighing it, and without checking his number, and they gave it to him first before they had asked anything of him at all. And when he had eaten, an older man among them looked at the rag on his hand and unwrapped it without disgust, and cleaned the ruin the press had made and dressed it properly, and looked too at a cyst that had grown for 10 years on the side of Rel's neck, that the imperial medics had seen a dozen times and never once touched, and said that it could be dealt with, and dealt with it. And then the impossible thing happened, the thing that undid him more completely than the food or the medicine. They listened. Someone asked him about his day, and he began haltingly, expecting to be cut short, to tell them about the rat's tail he had found in his ration, and how he had made it last across 2 bites, and he braced for them to laugh at him, at the smallness of it, at the poverty of a joy like that. They did not laugh. They were glad for him warmly and without show, as though a good thing happening to Relvanta were a good thing in itself, and worth being glad about. And one of them put a hand on his shoulder and looked him in the eye, those same eyes no one had troubled to meet in 40 years, and told him that he deserved better than the floor, that they all did, that the world was cruel, and that its cruelty was not his fault, and never had been. And a thing happened to Relvanter that the Imperium had never issued him by ration. He felt needed. He felt that he mattered, that he was a person someone was glad to see, and he did not notice the evening he began coming back every night, nor the week these people had quietly become the only warmth in his life, nor the month they had become in every way that meant anything to him, his family. He learned their faces the way he had never been allowed to learn anyone's. He learned that the old man who had dressed his hand was called Otto, and had worked the same press line Rel worked 40 years before, and carried the same 2 missing fingers, and had come down into the tunnel a broken man and been made whole, or something near enough to whole that he could smile about the fingers. Now, he learned that Mara had lost 3 children to the birthing schools and the shifts and the slow attrition of the deep, and had grieved them alone in the dark for years before the family found her, and that the warmth she poured out on the numbered men of the floor came from a well that the Imperium had dug in her with its own indifference. He learned that everyone in the tunnel had a story shaped like his own, that the family was made entirely of people the hive had used up and thrown down, and that this was not a coincidence but a harvest, though he had no word for it and would not have believed the word if he had. He knew only that for the first time in his life he was among people who had been where he had been, and who did not look through him, and who were glad, actually and visibly glad, on the evenings he came down out of the gray and into the warm. They did not break him with fear. The Imperium had spent his whole life breaking him with fear, and it had ground him down into a man who could be bought with a bowl of warm food and one honest question, and the people in the tunnel simply walked up and paid that small and shameful price, and Relvanter went to them gladly, and counted himself blessed, and in a narrow and terrible way he was not wrong. There came a night when they told him there was someone he ought to meet. The father of the family, they called him, the one who had begun all of this, who had gathered them one by one out of the dark and made of them something that loved, and the small quiet thought that had first stirred in Rel on the lip of the conveyor trough, the thought that there might be somewhere something better than the floor, had by now grown into something he could almost look at directly, and they led him deeper into the old workings, past the reach of the lumens, to a chamber where the father waited, and there they let him look upon it. He did not see what stood before him. That was the mercy of the thing, and its horror. What stood before him was a hunched and many-armed shape, a mountain of corded muscle the color of a bruise, with purple eyes that held their own faint light and a carapace like old chitin, a thing that would have opened a squad of the Emperor's own angels of death and not troubled its breathing to do it. But Relvanter did not see that. He saw a father. He saw the source of all the warmth that had been given him, and he wept and went forward and the thing drew him close for a moment, almost an embrace, and in that closeness it put its DNA into him through a slender ovipositor, an act the family called, with tenderness, the kiss. He woke 2 hours later without a scratch on him, and without a single memory of the chamber, and with a warm certainty that he had at last been accepted, which was in the broad shape of it, true. There was something in his head now that had not been there before. A shining messenger, an angel with a voice like poured honey, and it spoke to him in the quiet hours and told him things he had never dared to hope. It told him a day of reckoning was coming, that this rotten world would burn and soon, but that he, Rel Vanter, was chosen, and would be lifted up and saved, and that all he need do to earn his place among the risen was to bring a few more souls as deserving as himself into the warmth of the family. And he did. He brought them gladly. He went among the men of the floor, the numbered and the unmet, and he sat with them and asked them how they were doing, and looked them in the eye, and one by one he led them down into the old tunnel, into the food and the warmth and the family. And he did not know, and would not have believed, that he was baiting a trap with the only bait it needed, which was kindness. He was still in those days technically a man. The angel in his head told him he was more than a man, that he was chosen, and he believed it, and he was happy, happier than he had been in the whole long gray ledger of his life. And that happiness was real, and that is the part that ought to be understood before anything else. There was a young man on the floor named Thomas, who had come down from the birthing schools only a year before and had not yet had the light ground out of him, and who still, sometimes, looked up at the sealed gray ceiling of the manufactorum as though he half expected it to open. Rel had watched him lose a little more of that every month, the way a man watches the wick of a lamp burn down, and one shift, when Tomas had taken a beating from the overseers for a fault that was not his, and stood afterward at his station with his shoulders shaking and no one meeting his eye, Rel went to him in the last hour, and sat with him, and asked him how he was doing, and looked at him while he answered, and told him there was a place. It took Thomas 3 nights, as it had taken Rel 3 nights, and on the 3rd night the young man's ration failed to issue, in a small way that no register would ever show, and that Rel had quietly seen to. And Tomas came down into the warm dark, and was fed, and was listened to, and was held. And Rel stood at the edge of the tunnel, and watched the family gather the boy in, and felt a happiness so large and so clean that it frightened him, and did not understand, and could not have understood. That he had just done to Tomas exactly what had been done to him, and that the warmth flooding through him was the trap closing. The two things had been made in him, one and the same kindness and the springing of the snare, and that was not an accident. It had taken the Imperium 4 decades of patient cruelty to prepare that ground. The cult had only to walk up and plant the seed. The dream came to him often in those last years. It was always the same. The sky, which he had never seen, cracked open above him like a shell, and down out of the light came shining figures on vast and glimmering wings, golden-haired, radiant, bearing swords of fire, descending to raise up the worthy and to burn the rest. And he stood among his family with his face turned up to them, and wept for joy. He never told anyone the dream in words, because it was too large for words, but he need not have told it, for the same dream was dreamed by all of them, and it was older than Rel Vanter, and it would outlast him. It had a name now, and in the deep chambers they had begun to sing that name. Rel Vanter did not live to see the day he had been promised. He died as the men of the floor died, which is to say without ceremony and without record. Some failure of the heart or the lungs after a life of 16-hour shifts, and the family grieved him truly, and buried him in the deep warm dark, and that was more mourning than the Imperium had ever thought to spend on him. But before he died he had done the one thing that had been asked of him beyond the bringing of souls. His firstborn, conceived after the kiss, had come into the world changed, for the kiss had rewritten in him the very machinery of his blood, and what Relvanter fathered was not a man. It was a first-generation hybrid, a thing the cult called an acolyte, and it was a monster, and no one who was honest could have called it otherwise. It was hunched and grey and had a third arm that ended in a Genestealer's claw, and it could no more have passed among men than could the father in the chamber below. They kept it underground and forbade it the light. But here was the strange grace of that family, the thing the men above could never have understood. They looked upon it and saw beauty. They looked at the hunched and clawed and purple-eyed thing that Relvanter had fathered, and saw the most beautiful newborn in all the world, blessed by the star gods, marked by the kindness of heaven, and they loved it without reserve. While the blind fools 2 kilometers up would have called such a child a horror and put it to the fire. By the time Relvanter was 2 years in the ground, the thing about the better life had grown past a thought and hardened into a certainty in the blood he had left behind. It was no longer a hope of somewhere better. It was the settled knowledge, carried now in more than one skull, that they were the chosen, and that the gods were coming, and it had a name, and the name was sung, and the number of those who sang it was quietly growing in the deep places under the hive, one warm bowl and one honest question at a time. The years went down into the dark of the hive, the way all things went down there, without much marking, and the blood of Relvanter thinned across the generations toward the shape of a man again, and toward the shape of an ascension. The first generation had been a monster that could not walk among men. The second was a little more a man, still with 3 arms, still with the 1 claw, but a fighter now, cunning and quick, and it learned the ways of the deep tunnels and the smuggling runs, and the quiet work of keeping a secret church alive beneath a hostile city. The third was a neophyte, and the third was the first of the blood in 100 years to be permitted the light. It was bald, for all the hybrids were bald, and its skin held a faint bruised tinge, but with the hood thrown up and the head kept down it could pass, at a distance, for one more of the numberless numbered men of the floor. And so they sent it up to work, down the mines onto the manufactorum floor, into the loading docks, an ordinary laborer among millions, and no one gave it a second glance, while it quietly turned a mining laser into something that could open a tank and stockpile charges against the day. Not every birth ran true along that patient road toward the shape of a man. Sometimes the blood turned the wrong way, and at any generation, out of 2 parents who could have passed for anyone on the floor, there came instead an aberrant, a thing that only grew and grew, half blind and slabbed with muscle, its mind clouded by a pain it had been born into and would carry to the end. There was such a one in a hab in the 4th hold, a child the family called Little Enoch, though he was neither little nor in any way the hive above would have granted. A child, he had come out wrong and enormous and hurting, and his mother who had carried him, and would have carried any child the star gods sent her, looked at the towering half-made ruin of him, and saw the most beautiful thing she had ever made, and loved him without measure, and hid him in the cellar beneath the hab, where the light could not reach him and the enforcers could not find him, and fed him by hand in the dark for the whole of his life. They put a great mining hammer into his hands when he was grown, because his hands could hold nothing gentler, and they taught him the one thing he could be taught, which was to wait and to come out swinging on the day he was told to and not before. He was loved. That is the part the hive above could never have believed, that a thing like Little Enoch was loved, truly and daily, wept over and sung to and kept, and that the keeping of him in the dark was not a shame to that family, but a devotion, a treasure locked away against the morning it would at last be spent. He was a source of pride, and he was a prisoner, and to the family those were not 2 things but one, and they tended him for years in the cellar, with the patience of people minting a coin they would only ever be allowed to spend once. And there were others of that wrong-turned kind, scattered through the holds in their hidden rooms, the ones the family called metamorphs, hybrids, that had sprouted scythes and hooks where a man's hands should have been, or a second jaw, or a spine that would not let them stand as men stand. Living echoes of the true warrior shapes the swarm would one day send. They too were kept from the light, and they too were loved, each of them the pride and the private grief of some mother, or some brother, who looked at the claws and the wrongness, and saw only a blessing that had come to their house and not to their neighbors. The hive above, had it ever seen into those rooms, would have burned them to the last and called it mercy. The family looked into the same rooms and saw the marks of heaven's own favor, and fed them by hand, and waited, and this was the thing that no inquisitor and no enforcer ever truly grasped about the cult, that its strength was never fear and never force, but exactly this: a love so total and so patient that it could raise a monster in a cellar for 20 years and call every day of it a gift. But it was the fourth generation that stood the cult upright at last, and it was the fourth generation that produced in a mine worker's hab that the reclamation registers listed as empty, a hybrid in whom the star blood came down at last upon a mind already turned toward the warp, and made of that volatile marriage a sorcerer with a voice that men could not disobey. They called him the Magus, and among the family he was called Silas, and Silas was the face the cult would show the sunlit world. The patriarch could not be shown. It lay in the warm dark beneath the hive, grown vast now on the strength of a swelling brood, and it was not a thing that could be brought into a governor's hall. But Silas could go anywhere. He was tall and unhunched, and there was about him only the faintest wrongness of the skin, easily taken for the pallor of a man of learning, and when he spoke, the reasonable part of whoever heard him laid itself quietly down and agreed. He put on fine robes, and he went up out of the deep places into the spires of the aristocracy, and he founded a movement. It was a perfectly legal movement. That was the beauty of the thing, and Silas savored it the way a craftsman savors a joint that needs no nail. He preached, in the upper hive, a doctrine of renewal, of a coming age when the long suffering of Threnos would be answered from the stars, and he preached it in a register the aristocracy found flattering rather than frightening, all uplift and destiny, and the special election of Cadmus among worlds. And the bored and anxious lords of a dying hive drank it down like wine. He asked nothing seditious. He spoke no word against the emperor that any inquisitor could have written down. He held gatherings that were registered and taxed, and entirely within the letter of imperial law, and at those gatherings the great and the comfortable of the hive sat and felt, many of them for the first time in their soft and frightened lives, that they were part of something that would not end. And Silas listened. This was the thing he did better than any Lord's confessor, better than any rival demagogue in the sunlit hive, and it was the same thing, precisely the same, that a woman named Mara had once done on the lip of a conveyor trough 4 generations down and 100 years gone. He asked the frightened people how they were doing, and he looked at them while they answered, and he made each of them feel, for the length of the answer, like the only soul in the world worth the looking. There was a man named Halden who was chief of the household staff to the planetary governor's youngest son, a soft and frightened and unimportant man in a soft and frightened and unimportant post, and it was Halden that Silas took first, and Halden that opened, in the end, the governor's own doors. Silas did not bribe him and did not threaten him. He met him at one of the registered gatherings, and he asked him how he was doing, and Halden, who had spent 30 years being looked through by his betters exactly as Relvanta had been looked through on the floor, for the spires had their own numbered and unmet, found himself telling this gentle stranger things he had told no one, the smallness of his life and the fear of his master's temper and the ache of having served a house for 3 decades and being no more to it than a fixture, a thing that opened doors. And Silas listened and looked at him and told him that he deserved better, and meant it in the way the cult always meant it, which was the terrible thing, and Halden was his. Through Halden came an under-secretary, and through the under-secretary a magistrate, and through the magistrate a colonel of the household guard, and none of them were bought, and none of them were forced, and every one of them would have said, if asked, that they had come to the movement freely. Out of a hunger they had not known, they carried until Silas named it for them, and told them it was holy. He seated his people on the councils the way a patient man seeds a garden in full daylight, taxed and registered and thanked, and the great and comfortable of the hive congratulated themselves on their tolerance, on their broad-mindedness in permitting so harmless and uplifting a faith, and did not feel the roots going down beneath their floors, and would not feel them until the floors gave way. By now the dream had grown into a religion of state. It had temples, real ones built with real coin, gathered in the collection plates of Silas's registered and law-abiding movement. It had hymns, and a clergy, and a calendar, and marked upon that calendar, in a hand only the innermost knew how to read, was a date precise to the day for the ending of the world. The shining figures on their vast wings were no longer a private thing dreamed alone in the dark. They were painted on temple ceilings. They were sung to. They were the promised end toward which the whole slow, patient machine of Silas's church was turning, and the nearer the marked date came, the more often the faithful dreamed of the crack in the sky and the descent of the golden host, and woke weeping with a joy they could not explain to the unblessed. On the high feast of the movement, which the calendars of the hive now marked as a licensed holy day, the great temple that Silas's church had raised in the third tier of Threnos filled to its doors and past them, and the people came up out of the lower holes in their tens of thousands, in their patched and faded best, to stand beneath a ceiling on which the coming host had been painted in gold leaf bought with the pennies of the poor. The unblessed came too, the merely curious and the merely lonely, and stood among the faithful and felt the warmth of the singing, and the press of the glad crowd and the great painted angels stooping down out of the painted sky, and some of them wept without knowing why, and some of them came back the next week, and the week after, and were asked gently, by a kind new friend, how they were doing. The hymns were beautiful. This is the part too easily left out of the telling, that the hymns were truly beautiful, that the music of the cult was among the finest ever made in the deep hive, and that it lifted the heart, and that the lifting was real, even though the thing it lifted the heart toward was a mouth. Silas stood at the high altar in his fine robes, and raised his hands and his voice over all of it, and named the date, the marked and holy date, the day the sky would open, and told them it was near. And the whole vast congregation shivered with a joy indistinguishable from the joy of the saved, because there is no instrument yet made that can tell those two apart from the inside. Silas himself did not dream it as the laborers did, in wonder and terror. He knew rather more of what was coming than the flock beneath him, though not in the end as much as he believed. But he understood his function, and he loved it in his cold and eloquent way. Beneath him in the dark, the patriarch dreamed, and its dream flowed up through the psychic web that bound the brood into the sleeping minds of the faithful, and Silas stood at the meeting of the two worlds, the dark church below, and the sunlit one above, and translated the hunger of a God into the language of hope. And men called it good news, and gave him their houses and their offices and their children, and thanked him. And there was another generation coming behind Silas, and it would be the fourth generation's own work, out in the sunlit hive, that carried the thing to the very edge of the day it had been building toward. For among the hybrids of that generation was one who could pass not at a distance, but at arm's length, in full light under a suspicious eye and hold. His name was Corinventer, and the blood of Rel ran in him, thinned across 5 generations to the shape of a wholly ordinary man, and he was the most dangerous thing the cult had yet made, because there was nothing to see. Beneath the sunlit church that Silas built, the older work went on in the dark, patient and unglamorous and endless. There were hybrids of the third generation who spent their whole lives in the mines and the manufactorums, hooded and head down, doing the labor of the hive better than the hive's own trueborn did it, because they had a reason to, and the trueborn had only a quota. They were praised for it, when they were noticed at all. Overseers held them up as examples of diligence. Model workers, the sort the hive would run better for having more of, and never once suspected that the diligence was aimed patiently and across decades at the day these same model workers would drop the manufactorum on the heads of the men who praised them. They turned the mining lasers into things that opened tanks. They walked the charges out of the armories one cell at a time. They mapped, in their heads, over years, every junction and stairwell and service duct of the hive they labored in, so that when the hour came, they could move through it in the dark, the way blood moves through a body. And they did all of this while drawing a wage and a ration and a word of praise. And the men above them went on looking at the number and not the face, so that in the one way that had ever mattered on the floor, nothing at all had changed, and it was that unchanging blindness, more than any weapon the cult ever forged, that would bring the hive down in the end. Corin Vanter was liked by everyone who met him, and the being liked was the whole of his work. There was no hunch in him and no claw, no third arm, nothing of the warm dark thing that lay beneath the city and dreamed of stars. There was only a faint bruised undertone to the skin, which he put down, when anyone remarked it, to the rock dust of the lower mines, and an inherited steadiness in the eye that made men trust him past all reason, and want to follow where he went. He wore the gray of the Thranos Planetary Defense Force, and he wore it well, and he was a model of the ranks, and not one of his officers knew that the diligence they praised in him was bent, entirely and without remainder, toward the day he would turn the garrison's own guns upon the city it defended. He was, in the most exact sense, the soldier every sergeant wished he had. He was early to the muster, and last from the mess. He volunteered for the armory details and the inventory watches, and no one thought to wonder why a man would seek out the dull work of counting guns, or where a certain steady trickle of charges and cells and cutting lances went, listed always as spoiled, or damaged or expended in drills that the range logs, had anyone cross-checked them, did not quite show. He recruited too in the barracks, the same way his forefather had recruited on the floor, by finding the lonely and the ground down and the unmet, and sitting with them and asking them how they were doing. The garrison of Thranos was rotten most of the way through before a single officer suspected anything at all, and the reason no officer suspected was the reason the whole thing worked, which is that the men above still looked at a soldier's record and not at his face. There was one man on Cadmus who felt it. He could not have proved it, and when he tried to say it aloud, it came apart in his mouth into a handful of small things that sounded, spoken separately, like nothing. His name was Murek Vane, and he was a sergeant of the Adeptus Arbites, and it was his particular curse to be a man who noticed. What Vane noticed was small. In the lower holds, more people went missing than the reclamation registers accounted for, a slow, steady leak of souls that no single ledger showed, but that a man who read across all the ledgers could feel, the way Relvanter's descendant could feel the rock dust in his own blood. Mining lasers were written off as broken at a rate that no honest wear could explain, and when Vane went looking for the broken lasers on the scrap metal manifests, to see them melted down as the regulations required, they were not there. And in the manufactorums and the barracks and the low chapels there had come to be a kind of man everyone loved a little more than a man in that place had any business being loved. And behind that love Vane sensed something patient and organized and entirely without a name he could put to it. The thing that first turned Vane's noticing into a fear he could not put down was a woman named Selavek, who had reported her brother missing out of the fourth hold reclamation gangs, and had come to the precinct 3 times about it and been turned away twice, and on the 3rd time had been heard by Vane, because Vane was on the desk, and Vane was a man who listened. The brother had joined a chapel, she said, one of the low new chapels that had opened in the hold, all kindness and hot food, and had grown happy in a way she did not trust, and had come home less and less, and then not at all. And when she went to the chapel to find him, the people there were gentle with her, and sorry for her, and entirely smoothly certain that they had never known any man by his name. Vane pulled the reclamation rolls. The brother was listed as transferred. He pulled the transfer manifests. The transfer was to a gang that, when he ran it down, did not exist and had not existed for a decade, and drew nonetheless. A ration and a wage that were signed for each month by a hand he could not trace. He sat with that for a long time. A man could vanish on Cadmus 1,000 ways that meant nothing. A fall in a shaft, a knife in the dark, a number struck by clerical error. But a man who vanished and went on drawing rations, a man erased from the world and yet still fed by it, that was not death. That was something keeping him somewhere and feeding him and hiding the feeding inside the machinery of the hive itself. And Vane had no name for a thing that could do that, and the not having of a name was the worst of it, because you cannot indict a thing you cannot name, and you cannot make another man see it, and you begin slowly to wonder whether the thing is in the hold at all, or only in your own head. Selavec stopped coming to the precinct after a while. When Vane went to find her, some months on, to tell her that he had not forgotten, the people at her hab were gentle with him, and sorry and entirely certain they had never known any woman by her name. He raised it twice. The first time he was heard out with the weary courtesy the machine keeps for a man reporting a feeling, and directed to the next authority above him, who was a busy man and did not feel it. The second time Vane wrote it all down, carefully, the missing souls and the vanished lasers and the two beloved men, and he submitted it up the chain in proper form, and it entered the administratum of the hive and sank into a depth of accumulated paper so vast and so slow that an answer, had one ever come, would have come in something better than 500 years. And Merrick Vane understood then what a handful of men across the long history of the Imperium have understood, always too late for it to matter, that this world's enemy would not announce itself with a war fleet in high orbit. That it was already here. That it was the well-liked new man at the next bench, with a good record and a steady eye, and that by the time you could see it plainly, it was already, in every way that counted, family. He and Corin Vanta knew each other toward the end. It could not have been otherwise in a hive where the Arbites and the defense force worked the same cordons and stood the same lines during the food riots that came, now, more often than they used to. They stood a checkpoint together through one long shift, the sergeant of the law and the model soldier of the garrison, and they spoke a little of small things, of the failing water in the 6th hold, and the half rations and the crying of the children in the lower dark. And Vane found the young defense force man steady and decent and easy to stand a watch beside, and was glad of the company, and thought more than once in the years after that he had liked Corin Vanta, and could not for his life have said what it was about the man that he did not trust. They talked that long watch the way men on a cold line talk, to keep the hours moving. Corin asked the sergeant whether he had family in the hive, and Vane said he had a sister once in the 9th hold, and had not heard from her in some years. And Corin was quiet a moment, and then said that the 9th hold had gone bad early, and that a man should not blame himself for a silence the hive had made. And there was such a plain and settled kindness in the saying of it, that Vane felt something in his chest ease that had been tight a long while, and was grateful, and did not know that the gratitude was itself the thing being done to him. He asked Corin the same in turn, whether he had people, and Corin smiled and said that he had a very large family, and that they were close, closer than most, and that he counted himself the most fortunate of men in that one thing at least. And Vane, who trusted almost no one, found that he believed him, and found that he liked the young soldier's steadiness and his easy way and the trouble he plainly took over the men under him, and thought, "That is a good soldier. That is the kind the guard should have more of," and could not have said, then or ever after, what the small cold thing was that moved at the very back of his mind while he thought it, the thing that would not come forward into words, the thing that noticed and was overruled and was right. The riots came more often in those years as the water failed in hold after hold, and the rations were cut and cut again. And it was on the cordon lines of those riots that the law and the garrison stood shoulder to shoulder against their own starving people. And it was there, more than anywhere, that the cult did its quietest and best recruiting, because a hungry crowd clubbed back into the dark by the Emperor's own enforcers is a field already plowed, and the kind new friend with the warm bowl had only to come along after and sow. Vane knew the riots for what they were, a symptom, and knew that the clubbing of them cured nothing and prepared much, and said so once, in a report, and the report went the way of all his reports, and the riots went on, and the crowds went home hungrier and angrier, and readier than before to believe that somewhere, someone at last was glad to see them. And all the while the infection was going off the world. This was the thing that no cordon could stop and no register could catch, and it was Corin Vanter's own generation that carried it. The boldest of the hybrids did what would have turned the last gray hairs of the Inquisition white. They enlisted in the Astra Militarum, the Emperor's own guard, and were loaded onto the troop transports and shipped off to wars 1,000 light years distant, and went gladly, with a single purpose folded quiet behind the steady eye, which was to seed a new world. One hybrid slipped into one regiment was 12 future worlds falling in their turn, and the Imperium carried the infection out across the stars with its own hands, for free, and paid a wage and a ration for the service, and the ration, when it came, was the same gray paste it had always been. From all of it there was no running. One of them was a young man the barracks knew as Joran, who had served 3 years in the Thranos garrison with a clean record and an easy manner, and had been, everyone agreed, a credit to the muster. And when the levy came for a war on a world whose name none of them could pronounce, Joran did not wait to be chosen, but stepped forward and volunteered, and his sergeant clapped him on the shoulder and called him the kind of man the Emperor needed, and meant it. They loaded him onto a troop transport with 40,000 others, and carried him off into the dark. And Joran went to his war 1,000 light years from the only world he had ever known, and fought in it, and by every account fought well, and was decorated once for holding a line that ought not to have held. And in the 3rd year of that campaign, in a rest camp behind the lines, on a world of red mud and endless rain, Joran found a tired soldier of a native regiment sitting alone in the wet with his ration gone cold, a man who had been looked through his whole life by officers who saw a number and not a face. And Joran sat down beside him, as one who had all the time in the world, and asked him how he was doing, and looked at him while he answered. The war would end, one way or another, as wars do, and the regiments would scatter home to 100 worlds, and on more than one of them, years later, a quiet new church would open, all kindness and hot food, and the people there would call it a local miracle, a mercy that had bloomed at home, and would never know that it had come to them in the kit bag of a decorated soldier who volunteered. And if there was any comfort to be had in the thought that some worlds at least were too well guarded for the rot to reach, the histories gave it the lie. In recent memory, a cult of exactly this kind had been uncovered on Holy Terra itself, the throne world of mankind, the most watched and warded planet in the galaxy, and it had been found entirely by accident, when a drug deal in the Underhive went wrong, and the local enforcers chased a fleeing gang down into a forgotten tangle of tunnels that turned out to be a nest thousands strong, ripening quietly beneath the skin of the holiest ground the species owned. The bureaucracy of Terra was so vast and so slow that a full response might have taken years had the Inquisition not intercepted the enforcers' own footage and moved first, and the lesson of it was plain and terrible and entirely unlearned. that nowhere was safe, because the threat did not come from the sky, but from the person at the next bench, and that by the time you could see it, it was already family. If it could sleep undetected beneath the Emperor's own throne, it could sleep beneath anything, and on Cadmus, where no one was watching at all, it did not have to sleep lightly. And when the cult felt secure enough at last to spare the bodies, it sent out into the void not only its infiltrators but its makers. A pure strain of the brood, hidden aboard a trade hauler, or standing as a deckhand on a void ship, or seated in the retinue of some rogue trader who did not know what he carried, would ride the dark to the next system and begin the whole patient thing again from nothing. One bowl of warm food and one honest question at a time. A single kiss, generations back and worlds away, could ripen into the ending of a dozen sons at once, each of them certain that its own quiet new church was a local miracle, a kindness that had bloomed at home. The Imperium had a doctrine for the enemy that came with banners and a fleet. It had none at all for the enemy that arrived as a polite new colleague with a kind face and excellent references, and by the time it built one, it was, on Cadmus, already the day. The day came the way the calendar had promised it, precise to the marked hour, and it began in the warm dark beneath the hive, where the patriarch, grown across a century and more into a mountain of teeth and claw, whose mind held millions in a single web, lifted one vast hand, and the world fell. It fell in a single evening. The neophytes came up out of the mines with their mining lasers that were not lasers anymore. The soldiers of the garrison, a rot 4 generations deep, turned the guns of Threnos upon the spires of Threnos, and the model soldiers among them served that hour better than they had ever served the Emperor. The cult officials, the well-loved men in the offices and the household staffs, opened the doors and cut the throats and turned the tanks, and the ones who had wormed their way onto the orbital defenses began methodically to flatten the world from above. And the ordinary people, the wholly uninfected, the numbered and the unmet, rose too in their thousands and took up pipes and blades and joined the rising, because the Imperium had been so kind to them across so many generations that they saw in the burning of the hive their one chance to throw off the yoke. And they did not understand, could not have understood, that they were not liberating their world, but dressing it for the table. They did not rise leaderless. Silas the Magus walked openly through the burning spires at last, in robes no longer needful of concealment, and where he passed the uninfected mobs fell in behind him weeping, and did not know why, for the voice that had charmed governors could raise a hive, and he turned it upon the crowds like a tide. Beside him went the one the family called the Primus, a hybrid bred and honed across a lifetime for exactly this hour, a general who had never fought a battle and had planned this one his whole life, and it was the Primus who had marked years before which junctions would be held, and which bridges dropped, and which gates opened from the inside, and the plan unfolded that night with the terrible smoothness of a thing long rehearsed. There was a Sanctus, a quiet killer, who had spent the patient years removing, one by one and always by accident or misadventure, the few men in the hive who could not be won with a warm bowl and an honest question, and who might have grown in time into a second Murek vein the machine would actually heed. And when the patriarch lifted its hand, up out of the deep came the ones the family had hidden and loved and fed in the cellars against this single day, the aberrants, towering half-blind slabs of muscle grown wrong and huge, that the family had put great hammers into the hands of and wept over and locked away, brought up now and pointed at the walls. Little Enoch came up out of his cellar in the 4th hold that night into the first open air. He had breathed in a life spent underground, and his mother walked before him with a lamp and wept, not from fear but from a joy she had held back for years, because the morning she had kept him for had come at last, and her son, her beautiful and terrible son, was needed. He swung the great hammer where she pointed him, and the walls of Thranos came down under it, and for the one day of his life he was not a secret and not a shame, but a glory led out into the light, and he did not understand any of it, and he was happy, in the clouded way that was the only way left to him, because his mother was near, and her voice was glad. And behind the aberrants came the puristrings, the fifth-generation firstborn that were an exact copy of the thing that had kissed Relvanter 100 years gone, the perfect killers the whole cult had been bound in its blood to protect at any cost, because they were the guarantee that the coming swarm would be pleased with the meal. They came out of the warm dark at last and went through the defenders of Thranos the way a scythe goes through standing corn. Marek Vane died in the first hour, on the steps of his own precinct, and the man who killed him was a man he knew. It was not a stranger, and it was not a howling cultist with the star daubed on its brow. It was a soldier of the garrison. Vane had stood a checkpoint beside a decent, steady, well-liked man, and Vane, turning at the last, had a half-instant to see the face, and what he saw in it undid him more completely than the blow that followed. There was no hatred there. There was no fury and no madness and no cruelty. There was love. The man who killed Marek Vane looked upon him with a terrible tenderness, as one who is sorry to be leaving a friend on the wrong side of a closing door. And that look, and not the death, was the last thing the sergeant of the Arbites carried out of the world, and it was worse than any hatred could have been. Corin Vanter did not kill Vane. He was elsewhere in that hour, at the head of the men he had spent his life quietly turning, and he was weeping, though not from grief. The web that bound the brood had opened wide in that hour, and the patriarch's dream was pouring through it undammed at last into every mind that carried the blood, and the psychic scream of the god beneath the city was climbing out through the substance of the world and into the void beyond it, and working there, patiently, as a beacon for the real God, for the true family of which the patriarch was only the herald, for the swarm. And the sky cracked open, as it had cracked open in the dream of Relvanter 100 years and 5 generations gone, and they came down. Corin Vanter stood in the ruin of the upper hive amid millions of his kin, and every face around him was a beloved face, and every face was turned up to the broken sky and streaming with tears of joy, and Corin wept with them, because the gods had come for them at last, and he saw the angels. He saw them exactly as the dream had always shown them. Shining figures, golden-haired and radiant, borne down on vast and glimmering wings, bearing swords of fire, descending out of the light to lift up the worthy and to punish the unbelieving. There they were, at the very last, the ascension he had been promised his whole life, and across the lives of every ancestor before him, the answer to the small quiet thought that had first stirred in a numbered man on the lip of a conveyor trough, and it was more beautiful than anything he had been shown. And he opened his arms to it. All around him the family were on their knees in the ash, hundreds of thousands of them, the neophytes still, with their guns in their hands, and the old women who had sung in the temple choirs, and the children who had been born already knowing the dream, and they had stopped fighting, all of them, in the same instant, because there was nothing left to fight for and everything to receive, and they lifted their faces and their arms to the descending light and wept and laughed, and called out the name they had sung their whole lives, and the sound of it went up from the ruin of Thranos like a single voice. A whole world's worth of gratitude poured out at once toward heaven. Corin Vanter had lived his life among these people and had never seen them so beautiful. Every face was open. Every face was, for the first time and the last, entirely unafraid. This was the thing the cult had truly given them, the thing the Imperium in 10,000 years had never once issued to a single soul on Cadmus, and it was worth to them, in that moment, the whole of the price, the lies and the murder and the ending of the world, all of it. For this one upturned an unafraid instant beneath the opening sky. He did not see what a cold eye above the battlefield would have seen. He did not see that his angels came down on glistening tentacles, that the wings were membranes stretched on living struts, that the sky behind them was going black with gargoyles and drifting spores, that the radiant golden host descending to save the chosen of Cadmus was the leading edge of a hive fleet, and that his beautiful winged savior was a slab of many-limbed swarm flesh unhinging its jaw. He did not see it. The patriarch had lied to him his whole life, and to his father, and to his father's fathers, all the way down to Rel, and in one thing only was it merciful at the end, which was that it did not cut the link. The creature took Corin Vanter. It drew him close, almost gently, almost as the father in the chamber had once drawn Rel close for the kiss, and the shining messenger that had lived in the blood of his family for 100 years spoke to him one last time in the voice like poured honey, and it told him tenderly how proud it was of him, how it loved him, what a good and faithful soul he was to have lived to see this glorious day. And only in the last fraction of a second, when the jaws were already closing, did the honey fail and the light go out and the illusion crack, and Corin Vanter saw the whole of it plainly as it was. He saw that the angel was the thing that was eating him. He saw that everything his blood had done across 8 generations, all the loyalty and the lies and the patient murder, and the real, the genuine, the unbearable love, had come to this and only this, that they had fattened their own world across 100 years and served it up whole on a platter to a thing for which they had never been sons, never been chosen, never been righteous. They had been protein, like a rat's tail found by chance in another creature's ration, a small lucky windfall in someone else's meal, and now the meal was being eaten. The world of Cadmus was gnawed down to the bare rock beneath the hives. The family, all the beloved faces, went into the swarm's reprocessing to be remade into biomass, and the patriarch's beacon was already fading because the conductor had gone into the great digestion, a half step behind the orchestra, its work complete, its usefulness spent, dismissed at last by the god it had served. It took the swarm a matter of days to do to Cadmus what the cult had taken 100 years to prepare. The great digestion pools were let down into the hives, and the beloved faces went into them. The neophytes and the choir singers and the aberrants that had been wept over in the cellars and the children who had been born knowing the dream, all of it, all of them, rendered down into the raw stuff of life and drawn up into the belly of the fleet to feed the making of more fleet. Little Enoch went into the pools with his hammer still in his hands, a single day of daylight, the whole of what the world had ever given him, and his mother went in a step behind, and she was not afraid even then, because she believed to the last breath that they were being lifted up together. And in a manner she had never meant she was not entirely wrong, for they were lifted, both of them, into the body of the god and made one with it, and never parted after. The oceans were drunk, the air was taken, the very rock was stripped of what could be used, and what could not be used was left, and when the fleet moved on it, left behind a grey and silent stone turning in the dark, gnawed down past the deepest gallery Rel Vanter had ever stood in, past the warm chamber where the father had waited, past everything, a clean-picked bone where a world had been. And the psychic scream that had called the swarm down, the beacon the patriarch had spent its whole long life growing toward the strength to make, was already thinning to nothing, because the patriarch itself had gone into the pools a half step behind the least of its children, the conductor swallowed by the orchestra. Its usefulness ended the instant the guests sat down. It had not been chosen either. It had not, at the very last, been spared the knowing of that. And somewhere on the next flotilla over, 1,000 light years away and already underway, a hybrid of the 4th generation with the same steady, charming eye was walking down a boarding ramp onto a world that had never heard the name of Cadmus. It was a tired world and a hungry one, as such worlds are, and on its lowest level, in the deep of some hive that had a number longer than its name, it found a worker at the end of a long shift. A man who had been happy that very day because he had found a rat's tail in his ration and made it last across 2 bites. The hybrid sat down beside him on the lip of the trough, as one who had all the time in the world. It looked him in the eye, the way no one on that factory floor had looked at him in 40 years. And it asked him how he was doing. About one thing, and one thing only, the Imperium had always been right. He truly had been chosen, only not for the thing they had sung to him about.